I was going to take the weekend off when I saw the gospel. Let Father Mann come in to explain it. Because I trust that today's gospel disturbed you, even shocked you, or at least puzzles you. An employee who cheats on his employer, a manager who manipulates his master's money to make friends for his coming forced retirement, and a master who, with Jesus' approval, is seemingly praising the dishonest manager because, as the gospel says, he acted shrewdly. Well, this is very strange business ethics indeed, not quite the stuff that we teach here at UCSD. I think in order to understand this, we need to look at three things. One, what did the parable mean in Jesus' own mind? Two, what application did the early Christians draw from the parable? And three, what might the parable say for you and me today? So Jesus, first century disciples, 21st century Christians. Biblical scholars have tried to reconstruct this parable. And so did I all week. And as far as I can tell, here's what's going on. There's a rich man who owns quite a bit of property. He has a manager whose job is to handle the finances of the estate. He has broad powers, much leeway for discretion. He's sort of like an accountant and a loan shark at the same time. He keeps his master's accounts, contracts loans in the owner's name. He can liquidate debts, and he can charge his own interest. That's the key. One day something happens to our manager. He's accused of dishonesty. We don't know by whom or of what exactly. What we do know is that he got fired, and he was told to prepare an inventory of the master's goods. So I can imagine that outside the office, the manager sits down, chin in hand, brow wrinkled, and what am I going to do? And then he gets an idea that, if it works out, maybe might solve his problem. It seems like what he was doing was charging interest over and above what his master's accounts were. So he had all these side deals, which is probably what caused him trouble in the first place. So he summons the master's debtors and tries to get himself out of it. First one comes over. The first debtor probably owed the master 500 gallons of olive oil, but the manager was charging him 1,000 to get his own cut. So he tells the debtor to change the promissory note to 500, which is the actual amount owed. I'm not making this up. This is what biblical scholars say. And the second person, he says, your IOU reads 1,000 bushels of wheat. So forget my 20%, change your promissory note to 800 bushels. So, technically, there's no dishonesty here. There's not the squandering for which he was fired. The manager is playing within the economic rules. He's not giving up the master's rightful return, only the interest that he himself charged for his own profit. And somehow, the owner gets wind of the deals and doesn't react in anger. He shakes his head in admiration. But notice that the owner does not praise the manager for squandering his property. That was something different altogether, and for that he had dismissed him. Nor does the owner praise the manager for lending out money at interest. That was against Jewish law, although it was very commonly practiced. He praises him for making a clever, ethical deal, doing what he was entitled to do. The manager is renouncing his own profit, renouncing usury, releasing the debts of fellow Jews. And Jesus, what does this parable have to do with the kingdom of God? I think simply this. The dishonest manager, at a critical moment in his life, when his entire future was at stake, acted decisively to cope with the crisis and planned shrewdly to secure his future. Similar for Christians in the first century. Jesus' preaching of the kingdom of God brings a crisis into our lives where we have to act decisively, plan shrewdly to accept the invitation to be part of that kingdom. Now, I know that's terribly abstract, and I can see all your eyes glazing over, because I think the early Christians felt the same way. After the death of Jesus, this parable must have been told over and over again at times when Christians were puzzled about its meaning. And they didn't even have a Jesuit to explain it. The result, well, that's where we get to the second part of today's gospel. 3 applications, 3 lessons, 3 concrete directives for living, which the first generation of Christians drew from this. First application: make wise use of material possessions, not because material things are evil in themselves, but because they can seduce us and lead us to dishonesty. Application 2: look at your day-to-day fidelity. If you cannot be trusted with something small, why should you be trusted with the whole thing? And application 3 is a general attitude towards wealth. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Not that you cannot have both. You can. Simply that you cannot make both your master. Which of the two will you serve? If gold is your God, then the God of Jesus Christ is not. We have to choose. So much for the parable as Jesus intended, so much for the 3 applications that the early Christians drew from it. But what about us? What will we draw from it? What might it say to us? What might Jesus be saying to us today? I think the link between the first century and the 21st century is that each of us has been put into this crisis situation. Each Christian, rich or poor, frightened or carefree, has to face up to a crisis, perhaps once, perhaps often, because the kingdom of God has been preached, not only to first century Jews, but to us. So what? So this: the kingdom of God is not a place. It's not like San Diego or Italy. The kingdom of God, the core of Jesus' preaching, is the ground of the Gospels, the rule of Christ over the human heart. The kingdom of God means that God acts in this world and that these acts lead to a transformation of the world. But the kingdom of God is not only good news. It is good news against. It is good news against injustice, against poverty, against violence, against persecution, against human trafficking, against dehumanization. The kingdom of God is a utopia that answers the age-old hope of a people in the midst of historical calamities. It is then what is good and wholly good. But it is also something liberating, since it arrives in the midst of and in opposition to any sort of oppression. The parable of the dishonest manager is a challenge to every Christian, more especially if you are gifted with the good things on earth, or hold in your hands the living and dying of others, or your ears ring with the applause of appreciative audiences. It is then especially that you have to confront the wisdom of the world with the foolishness of God. Where does God stand in our list of goals? Atop money, power, fame, whatever else? Then, like our manager friend, but even more shrewdly, we have to take our IOU that we have with God, we have to rip it up and write a new one. This time with less, not more. This time our IOU should say, I shall love the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, and with all my strength. And while you're at it, why not add, and I shall love my neighbor as myself.